Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. Today I'll be sharing with you my top 12 favorite books of the year 2022. I know this is kind of late, so I'm going to try to make it really short and to the point so that this will just kind of serve as my instant recommendations to you based on the best books that I've read in the year 2022. I think this goes without saying, but I guess I'll say it now. These aren't necessarily books that were released or published in 2022. These are books that I've read in 2022 that I found to just be kind of instant favorites. My first recommendation to you would be Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. This would often be shelved in like the adult fantasy section, but I think there's more focus on the mystery of the entire plot than the actual fantasy elements. You may have heard this said before, but I'll just say it now too. It is best to read this book kind of going in blind, because even giving out a few little details kind of not necessarily ruin or spoils the experience, but it kind of takes away from this. It's a very short book, so the more knowledge that you have, I guess the less surprises you're going to have reading it. But in order to, I guess, properly pique your interest in this book, I'll just give you like a little bit of information about it. All you need to know is that we are following our main character, who is called Piranesi, and he is in this world that's basically like this huge mansion full of staircases and hallways and statues, and he's just trying to document what's in this world and trying to find out why he is there. That's all you need to know. But this was such a ride. Number one, because I love the writing style of Susanna Clarke. This is my first time reading from her. The world building is incredibly immersive, and the reveals in this book are just utterly mind-blowing. I loved when we finally understand what's really going on in this world. Highly, highly recommend this. My next favorite and next recommendation would be Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. Now, I had a very wonderful opportunity of reading an ARC of this, or an advanced reader's copy. And this was back when basically no one knew about this book. And I just love how it has basically become such a popular book that now everyone wants to read it, or people who have read it in recent times have found that they absolutely love this book. This is classified as an adult cozy fantasy, and in this we follow our main character Viv, who is an orc. She has been a mercenary for so long, but she wants to retire and just settle down, and her life of adventure just move to this quaint town and open up a coffee shop. Coffee is like super rare in this world and no one really knows about it except for the gnomes. And in the original cover of this book, it's marketed as a high fantasy with low stakes. Definitely don't expect like fighting or things of that sort. And just expect a wonderful, heartwarming, cozy story with found family and beautiful friendships. So if that sounds like something up your alley, definitely give this a shot. My next favorite would have to be Queen of the Tiles by Hannah Alcaf. This is a young adult contemporary, I think, mystery. Also got to read an advanced reader's copy of this book, and man, I was absolutely hooked. This was also my first Hannah Alcaf book, and now I want to read like the rest of her books because I've heard so many great things about her writing and her characters. But in this book, we follow our main character Najwa, who is like this really cool Scrabble master. She also has severe anxiety, and what doesn't help that is one day, like this huge Scrabble competition, her best friend, who is also incredibly good at Scrabble, dies while playing. And so after taking kind of a Scrabble hiatus, she decides, okay, I'm gonna fight in the next competition. But suddenly now, she's suddenly getting all these weird messages that are hinting that someone knows about how her best friend died. I found this book to be kind of thrilling. I was at the edge of my seat the entire time. But I think the main reason that I love this book is how intelligent it is and how intellectually stimulating Hannah Alcaf's writing is. Obviously, since Scrabble is involved, there are a lot of like words and there's a lot of wordplay being thrown at you. And I love learning about all these words and the main character trying to connect the dots and see how these clues she's getting based on these Scrabble words, how they kind of paint the whole picture of how her best friend died. If you're looking for a book that you feel like you don't want to put down, definitely go for this book. The next favorite I'm going to recommend is not just one book, it's actually kind of a cheat because it's actually a whole series, and that is his Dark Materials series by Philip Pullman. I know I'm kind of late reading this because this has been sort of a fantasy classic for a very long time, but I only just read this last year. And man, I totally get why this is a classic. I think this is kind of a modern classic fantasy, and so I don't necessarily know how this would be classified, if it would be young adult, or middle grade. I feel like it could be middle grade, but it can be dark at times, like really dark. And I guess this is more of like a coming of age fantasy. Can't really tell you about books 2 and 3, but I'll tell you about the first book. It's set in the steampunk world where we follow Lyra and her demon, demons in this world are basically the equivalent of a soul, and they take the form of an animal companion. I think the heart of this story, while it does have, a story, I think the reason that people love this and why I love it is because of the themes that it explores. It is a very fierce critic of organized religion, so if that's something that maybe you might find offensive, that's actually why this has been banned in a lot of places, or it's particularly anti-Catholic. I do think even though you are kind of like staunch in your Christianity or whatever, this would be kind of a good book to read to kind of see the other side of things. It's a criticism on the abuse of power in organized religions and how many of these institutions have kind of controlled the distribution of knowledge. I also love the world building in this series. It's incredibly well realized. I found the world and the worlds to be endlessly fascinating in this series. I think the main reason that I found this series to be a favorite is because of a particular scene in the last few chapters of the final book, The Amber Spyglass, but I'm not going to get into that because that would be spoilery. But something about those scenes just was very relatable and kind of struck a chord in me. In particular, I'll just describe it vaguely. It has to do with how someone finding love led them to deconstruct their faith, and I just found that to be profoundly moving. My next favorite that I'm going to talk about is barely a book. It's actually a poem collection, and there's very few poems in it, and it's actually called Viral Poems, and these are a collection of the most popular poems that have circulated from the channel Button Poetry. If you've been around social media quite a bit, you've definitely seen one of these spoken word poems. And I enjoy that medium. I love listening to spoken word poetry, but actually reading the text is kind of a different experience, and I absolutely found again my love of these poems in written form. Definitely check that collection out if you enjoyed those poems. I changed my shirt because I realized that I had growing sweat stains on the previous shirt and it was starting to look gross. Anyway, my next recommendation for you is The Search for Wanda by Tony Lizzie, however you pronounce his name. This is a middle grade sci-fi, and oh my goodness, does this give Treasure Planet vibes. So if you love Treasure Planet, or what's that other movie, Atlantis, you're gonna love this book because it has well-realized world building, also kind of a found family, and just an overall fun adventure. It's not like the most thrilling adventure, but I just loved exploring this world. In this story, we follow our main character, Evan 9, who is raised by Mother, who is a robot. That's Mother. It's M-U-T-H-R, and it stands for something. And she has been raised underground for a very long time until an emergency happens in their kind of pod underground that they have to evacuate, and Evan 9 now has to brave the world outside and learn about the world that she has been living in for so long but has been secluded from because she was just living in this pod. Again, highly recommend this if you love Treasure Planet. That's all I'm gonna say because it's a fun story. Check it out. Ooh, and there's also really cool illustrations. They're not showing these things right there, these illustrations. They're really nice. Go check it out. The next favorite book that I'm going to recommend to you is Perfect on Paper by Sophie Gonzalez. This is a young adult contemporary romance where we follow our bisexual main character who's at this high school, and she gives out anonymous love advice through this locker. People ask for relationship advice, write out their email, put it in this locker that only she can access. She reads these questions, and because she has been obsessed with relationship advice podcasts and things of that sort, she kind of knows how to give the best advice for these fellow students of hers. And things kind of turn upside down when one day she is found out by this guy who asks for advice on how to get his girlfriend back. I absolutely love this book. It's so wholesome. It's also kind of stressful because the main character has just so many secrets that she's hiding. But also on top of all that, I absolutely love the bisexual representation in this book, particularly how validating it is for bisexuals who both pursue a relationship with a person of a similar sex or a person who is of a different sex. Because oftentimes in the queer community, we only validate those relationships that look queer or that are men loving men or women loving women. That we forget there are other ways to be queer, and those are equally valid and equally queer. And I just love that about this book as a bisexual myself. The next book that I'm going to recommend, which is also a favorite, is Marikit and the Ocean of Stars by Carice Avendaño Cruz. This is a middle grade fantasy, Filipino inspired, and it is the most wholesome and heartwarming middle grade book I have ever read. This might just be in my top 5 middle grade books, period. In this book, we follow our main character, Marikit, who grew up poor. Her mother is mute and is the best seamstress in town. But for some reason, her mother has never given her a beautiful dress. Marikit asks for one for her upcoming birthday, and her mother, instead of making her the blue glittery dress that she's been wanting for a very long time, makes this really odd dress that kind of looks like rags stitched together. And she explains that this dress is supposed to protect Marikit and also serves as a map through the land of Encanto. Just like this mystical land filled with Filipino mythological creatures. I absolutely loved this book. Number 1, because of the heartwarming story, but number 2, because of how unapologetically Filipino it is. It's such a love letter for young Filipino kids. And honestly, if I could afford it, I would gift this to every Filipino middle grade reader I know, because this is just so validating of Filipino-inspired fantasy. I don't know if that makes sense, but you know how most of the fantasy that young kids get to read are very Western-inspired? This is just so Filipino. I don't know how else to market this. And honestly, I think everyone is gonna love this. It's just so wholesome and magical and cute, so definitely check this book out. The next book I'm gonna recommend is a graphic novel, or a series of graphic novels. I read the first 3 volumes of Trece by, I believe like the story is by Budjetan and the art is by Kadjo Baldissimo. Also written by local Filipinos, so there's a plus. This is kind of a horror fantasy, and oh my gosh, I love the art style. I'm gonna give you a little bit of a sneak peek. It is giving, if you're familiar with the animated series Martin Mystery, this is like right up your alley. I loved Martin Mystery as a kid. Basically, I love fantasy mystery that kind of leans into the horror aspect of things. And in this series, we follow Detective Trece and her 2 sidekicks, the Kambal or the twins, as they try to solve, I guess, murder mysteries in the city of Manila. And these mysteries are linked to the supernatural. There are a lot of Filipino mythological creatures that are referenced. This is kind of like on the opposite side of the spectrum for Marikit, where in Marikit, it's more of a fluffy, cute, and wholesome representation of Filipino mythology. This, I guess, is more true to the darker aspects of our mythology, because Filipino mythological creatures tend to be really gruesome and ferocious and scary, and this kind of leans into that, and I just absolutely enjoyed the first 3 volumes. The next favorite book I'm going to be recommending is Patron Saints of Nothing by Randy Ribay. This is written by a Filipino-American author. This is a young adult contemporary novel where we follow our main character Jay, who is Filipino-American. And one day he finds out that his cousin, who is living in the Philippines, has died. And he's starting to suspect that his cousin's death is somehow linked to previous President Rodrigo Duterte's war on drugs. This book broke me in half. It was such a, number 1, such a thrilling read. It was also so well written. I love Randy Ribay's writing style, and I can't wait to read more from him. But on top of all of that, this was such an emotionally gripping book. As I read this book, like every chapter, I kid you not, my heart just like kept tightening and tightening, and until even after reading this book, I just had such a profound heartache, and I felt the character's pain. I wouldn't say this book is necessarily eye-opening because I'm quite familiar with how things were during President Duterte's regime, but I would say it's more, I guess, hard-hitting because of these, even though this book is fiction, the things that happened during President Duterte's regime were very real and very scary and very sad. So if you want to learn more about that and I guess the effect of a war on drugs on a country, definitely check this out. The next book I'm going to recommend is A Song for the Wild Bill by Becky Chambers. I have been recommended Becky Chambers books for the longest time, and last year was finally the year I decided to get onto reading one. And I get the hype, even though I've only read one. A Song for the Wild Bill is, I guess, number 1, so wholesome, But more than that, I feel like I've used this word multiple times by now, but it is so hard hitting. And I guess I have to explain what the book is about. In this book, we follow a tea monk. Their job is basically to concoct a specific kind of tea based on their client's needs. And one day this character meets a robot. And I know that might sound kind of corny and cartoonish, but this honestly isn't really about the plot or the story. It's more about the conversations that this tea monk and this robot have. They have kind of these philosophical discussions about life and the purpose of life and what it means to live. And I feel like if I had read it at a different time in my life, I would have found this to be boring, but I read it at a very specific time in my life where I desperately needed to read or to hear the words that I was reading. I would recommend this to people who, I guess, are kind of going through a sort of existential crisis, because this book in particular helped me to kind of process that sort of thing. And the last book that I'm going to be recommending that was a favorite of last year is The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. This book was astounding. It was absolutely compelling, marvelous, moving. In this book, we follow two main characters. They are sisters. They are both black, but white passing. And as they grow up, they kind of split ways. One decides to live as a black person, and the other decides to live as a white person. And it's also kind of a multi-generational book because we not only follow the sisters, but also their daughters and how their lives kind of entwine and come back together. I absolutely love this book. It's a great inspection of white passing privilege and that sort of thing, but also, of course, racism. But I guess on top of all that, it's also a very profound exploration of identity and how some parts of our identity we just can't simply erase and can't dismiss or forget about. They will always be a part of ourselves. But it's also how sometimes we try to shape our own identity and try to move past what makes us us and the consequences of those decisions. I think this is classified as literary fiction, and while I don't necessarily know what the boundaries are for what is literary fiction and what is contemporary, what is, what makes something literary necessarily, I think it is deserving of the accolades that it is getting in the sphere of literature. And that is it. Those are, I guess, my top 12 reads of last year in no particular order. They're in very different genres, so I hope you found something that piqued your interest. I absolutely loved doing this, and I hope you check any of these books out. And if you do, let me know and share your thoughts on any of these books. If you missed my previous video, I said there that I'm going to be mixing up my content on this channel. Basically, the goal is to put out a video every month about something that gives me joy, about something that excites me to talk about. And next month, I might not be putting out a bookish video. I do have another one planned pretty soon. And it will be another 12 book recommendations, also from last year. I'm going to be talking about books that aren't necessarily full 5-star reads or like instant favorites, but I highly, highly recommend that you check out. So stay tuned for that. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys give this a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Let me know down in the comments what book kind of changed your life last year and give me all those book recommendations. That is it, everyone. Have a good day.